In the fall of 1971, at a county equipment sale outside of Harlan, Iowa, a 38-year-old woman named Eunice Taggart paid $28 for a grain elevator that hadn't moved grain in 11 years. Not a broken elevator, not a seized elevator, a dead one. The drive shaft was snapped clean at the coupling, the belts had rotted off the pulleys, the motor housing had been stripped of its motor entirely, and the whole structure leaned about 4 degrees to the east like it was thinking about lying down. The auctioneer almost didn't bother. "We've got the Pemberton grain leg," he said. 12-inch bucket elevator, 60-foot run, no motor, no belts. And the frame's got a lean to it that I'm not going to call structural because I'm not an engineer. Who'll give me $15 for the iron weight? A scrap buyer from Shelby County raised 2 fingers. 15, called. 20, said Eunice. The scrap buyer looked at her the way men look at women who bid on broken things. He shrugged and dropped his hand. Eunice Taggart loaded the dead elevator onto her flatbed trailer with her son-in-law's help. It took 3 hours to dismantle enough of it to transport. She drove home, past the Harlan Grain Co-op, where Ray Sutter was standing outside the loading dock having a cigarette, and Ray watched the Pemberton elevator go by on the trailer, and he laughed out loud. Right there on the dock, laughed hard enough that his cigarette fell into the gravel. And he went inside and told the men at the counter that Eunice Taggart had just hauled off the most worthless piece of equipment in Shelby County. "Can't even move grain," he said. "Motor's gone. Belts are gone. Frame's bent. What's she going to do with it?" Stand it up in her yard as a monument to poor decisions. The men at the counter laughed. By the time Eunice got home to the farm outside of Portsmouth, the story was already moving. The way stories move in small Iowa counties, faster than trucks, slower than truth. Let me tell you about Eunice Taggart, because what she did with that broken elevator changed not just her own farm, but the way 3 neighboring farms stayed solvent through the worst years of the decade. And none of it makes sense unless you understand who Eunice was before she bought the thing. Eunice was born in 1933 in Shelby County, the second daughter of a man named Harmon Quill, who farmed 200 acres of bottomland corn ground and ran a small welding and fabrication shop out of his machine shed from about 1940 onward. Harmon hadn't planned on the shop. He'd bought a welder in 1939 to repair his own equipment, and discovered that he was better at it than almost anyone in the county. Neighbors started showing up with broken hitches and cracked cultivator frames and snapped drawbars. Harmon charged fair, and he stood behind his work. By 1945, the shop was bringing in more money than the corn. Harmon had no sons. He had Eunice and her younger sister Pauline, and Harmon being Harmon, that didn't change anything about how he ran the shop. Both girls grew up knowing how to strike an arc. Both girls knew how to read a tape measure and use a file and tell the difference between mild steel and high carbon by the spark pattern off the grinder wheel. But Eunice was the one who stayed in the shop after Pauline lost interest. Eunice was the one who asked questions Harmon didn't always have answers to, which meant they had to figure it out together. By the time Eunice was 16, she could weld better than her father on thin sheet stock. By 18, she could design a repair without being told what to do. Harmon never said much about it. He just handed her harder jobs. Eunice married a man named Gerald "Not" Taggart in 1955, a quiet farmer from Cass County who had 80 acres and a work ethic that matched hers. Gerald was not a machinist. He was a grower, patient and steady, and good at reading soil and weather. They complemented in the way that partnerships sometimes do when 2 people have completely different skills and the same values. Gerald grew the crops. Eunice fixed everything that broke, which on a working farm is most of it, most of the time. Gerald died in 1968 of a heart attack in the East Field. He was 41 years old. He left Eunice the 80 acres, a set of aging equipment, and a farm that was paid for because they had both been the kind of people who hated debt the way some people hate cold weather. Deeply, personally, like it was an affront. Eunice kept farming. She was 35 years old, and she had no intention of stopping. Her daughter Margie was 17, and Margie's boyfriend, soon-to-be husband, was a young man named Calvin Freer, who was willing to help with the field work in exchange for learning how farming actually functioned from a woman who had been doing it since she was old enough to carry a bucket. Eunice accepted the arrangement. She was practical about most things. By 1971, Eunice was farming 80 acres and running a small equipment repair business out of Harmon's old welding setup, which she'd improved considerably over the years. She had a decent MIG welder, a plasma cutter she'd bought, used from a closing fabrication shop in Council Bluffs, and a collection of tooling that she'd assembled piece by piece from auctions and estate sales over the course of 15 years. She was known in Shelby County as someone you called when the dealer said a part didn't exist anymore. She usually found a way to make it exist. When Eunice looked at the dead Pemberton elevator on her flatbed that October afternoon, she didn't see a broken machine. She saw a 60-foot structural frame made from honest heavy-gauge steel, a complete bucket assembly she could strip and reuse, 4 good head boot pulleys, and a boot section with a take-up that was still mechanically sound. She also saw something else, something she'd been thinking about for almost 2 years, since the summer of 1969, when the fans on her corn dryer failed during harvest, and she'd spent 3 days hand-shoveling wet corn to keep it from heating in the bin. There had to be a better way to move grain in and out of the bins without depending on a single point of failure. The elevator wasn't the answer by itself, but it was the frame for the answer. Let me tell you about what Eunice built, because this is where the story moves from salvage to engineering. The problem on Eunice's farm and on most small Iowa grain farms in the early 1970s was handling. Getting corn from the combine into the wagon was easy. Getting it from the wagon into the storage bins and back out again when the elevator operator wanted, it was where things got difficult and expensive. The standard setup was a single portable auger and a small elevator. One machine failed, and you were hand-shoveling, which, in a wet year, meant spoilage, which meant money gone. Eunice's plan was a redundant handling system. 2 paths in, 2 paths out, so that any single machine failure could be bypassed without stopping. She needed a second elevator leg that could feed her 2 largest bins independently. The Pemberton elevator frame, once straightened and properly braced, was exactly the right height for the job. 60 feet of lift was more than enough for her bin configuration. The motor problem was the main one. The Pemberton had come with no motor, and a new motor for an elevator that size, a proper agricultural duty motor with the right RPM and torque for grain handling, would have cost $340 in 1971. Eunice didn't spend $340 when she could spend $40. In September of 1971, a month before the county sale, she had driven to a government surplus liquidation in Des Moines, a sale of decommissioned industrial equipment from a closed ordnance depot outside of Ankeny. The government sold off the contents of the depot's maintenance facility: air compressors, generators, lathes, motors of various kinds. Eunice was looking at the motors specifically. She found what she wanted on pallet 6, row 3, a 3-phase industrial motor, 7.5 horsepower, from a decommissioned machine tool that the depot had retired. Government surplus tag said serviceable, removed during facility decommission. The machine had been shut down. The motor was fine. She paid $35 for it. A 7.5 horsepower three-phase motor that would have cost $290 new. More than adequate to drive the Pemberton elevator. Better than adequate, in fact, because the Pemberton had been designed for a smaller motor, and a larger one meant more torque reserve, which in grain handling meant less plugging on wet corn. She had the motor. She paid $28 for the elevator frame 6 weeks later. Total investment, $63. The engineering problem was this. A three-phase motor requires three-phase power. Eunice's farm, like most rural Iowa farms in 1971, ran on single-phase power from the Rural Electric Cooperative. You could not simply plug a three-phase motor into a single-phase line and expect it to run. Most people would have stopped there and gone back to looking for a single-phase motor, which would have cost more and done less. Eunice did not stop there. She built a phase converter. A rotary phase converter is not a simple device, but it is a buildable one if you understand electrical theory and have access to a lathe and a welder. The basic principle is that a second motor, wired in a particular way, generates the missing third phase from the two available. Eunice had read about the concept in a 1966 issue of a farm electrical journal that she'd pulled from Harmon's collection of technical magazines. She had thought about it abstractly for years. Now she had a reason to build one. She spent 3 weeks on the converter. She used a salvaged single-phase motor as the idler, wound new capacitors into the circuit to correct the phase angle, and built the housing from scrap steel plate. She tested it in the shop before she touched the elevator. When the three-phase motor ran on her single-phase line for the first time, it ran smooth and quiet and pulled the right amperage on all 3 legs. Eunice checked it with a borrowed ammeter, wrote down the numbers in the notebook she kept for every repair job, and went in for supper. Calvin, watching from the shop doorway, said he didn't understand exactly what she'd done. Eunice explained it in 2 sentences. He nodded like he understood. He didn't, but he was smart enough to know he'd seen something worth paying attention to. The elevator frame went up in November. Eunice straightened the 4-degree lean with a come-along and a ground anchor, cut the damaged section of base out entirely, and welded in new material from a scrap I-beam she'd bought at the same estate sale where she'd found the plasma cutter. The bucket belting she replaced with a new urethane belt from a farm supply catalog. The one expense she didn't try to shortcut because belt failure in a running elevator was dangerous ace in a way that other failures weren't. The belt cost $48. The entire project, the elevator frame, the motor, the phase converter materials, the new belt, the weld consumables and hardware, $147. In January of 1972, during a cold snap that dropped temperatures to 15 below, Eunice ran the first full test. She moved 200 bushels of corn from the east bin to the west bin and back, running the elevator continuously for 40 minutes. The motor didn't complain. The belt ran true. The phase converter held steady voltage the whole time. Ray Sutter, who worked the co-op dock, heard about it the way you hear about things in Shelby County. 3 different farmers told him the same thing in the same week. Eunice Taggart built herself a grain elevator out of the dead Pemberton rig and a government motor and some contraption she made in her shop that turns 1 phase of power into 3. Thing runs like it came out of a factory. Ray drove out to the Taggart farm on a Saturday in February, which is what men in those situations always do, because they cannot quite believe the thing until they see it. Eunice was in the shop repairing a cultivator frame for a neighbor when Ray pulled in. She came out, hands still dirty, and Ray looked at the elevator running a slow idle test against the east bin, and he looked at it for a long time without saying anything. "That's the Pemberton rig," he said finally, "that I watched you haul away from the auction in October." "That's right." "And that motor? What's that motor?" "Government surplus, Des Moines liquidation. 3-phase, 7.5 horsepower. That's a 3-phase motor. You don't have 3-phase service out here." "No." "Then how's it running?" "Phase converter. Built it in the shop." Ray was quiet for a while. He walked over to the converter housing and crouched down and looked at it, the way a man looks at a thing he can, almost, but not quite understand. He stood up. "What did the whole thing cost you?" Eunice told him. He made her say the number twice. $147, Ray said, "for a running grain elevator. With redundant bin capability," Eunice said. "Feeds the east and west bins independently. If my auger goes down during harvest, I can still move grain. If this goes down, I still have the auger. 2 paths in, 2 paths out. No single point of failure." Ray looked at the machine for another long moment. His face had a particular expression that Eunice recognized because she'd seen it on men's faces before. The expression that happens when a man realizes that a thing he considered laughable was actually better thought out than anything he could have managed himself. He didn't apologize right there. Men like Ray Sutter don't apologize in the moment. But he drove home without saying anything dismissive, which from Ray Sutter was the closest thing to an apology Eunice was going to get. Let me tell you about the next decade, because the phase converter was just the beginning. That was always the thing about Eunice Taggart. The elevator wasn't a project. It was a demonstration of a method. Within 2 years, 3 neighboring farmers had come to Eunice asking about phase converters. Each farm had equipment they couldn't run because of single-phase limitations. A hog farmer 2 miles east, had a commercial feed mixer and had been sitting unused since he bought it at an estate sale, because he hadn't known what to do with the power problem. A dairy farmer north of Portsmouth had a bulk tank compressor that was undersized for 3-phase and needed to be replaced, which would cost $600, money he didn't have. A retired couple south of town had inherited a small shop with a 1950s metal lathe that ran 3-phase, and they wanted to use it, but didn't know how. Eunice built converters for all of them. She charged $60 to $90 for each one, materials and time, not the price of expertise, because she didn't think of herself as charging for expertise. She was charging for materials and time. The expertise was just what she knew. She charged fair because Harmon had charged fair. That was the rule she'd grown up with, and she saw no reason to change it. Calvin, by this point firmly part of the farm operation, watched the side business develop and started keeping the books on it without being asked. He had a gift for organization that balanced Eunice's gift for fabrication. Between the farm income and the repair and fabrication work, they were clearing $8,000 to $10,000 a year through the mid-1970s in a county where most operations that size were struggling to show $5,000. The savings accumulated the way Eunice's father's savings had accumulated, quietly, invisibly, in a checking account at the Shelby County Savings Bank that had no loan attached to it. By 1980, Eunice had $61,000 in that account. The farm owed nothing. The shop owed nothing. The elevator, the converter, the equipment, all of it bought with cash or built from salvage. Then the crisis arrived. You know the story. Anyone who farmed or knew farmers in the early 1980s knows it in their bones. Interest rates climbed past 18%. Commodity prices fell. Land values, which had inflated through the 1970s on borrowed optimism and federal programs, collapsed. Farmers who had borrowed to buy land at $2,000 an acre found themselves holding ground worth $800 an acre with notes they couldn't service. The banks started calling loans. The auction started. Shelby County lost 4 farms between 1981 and 1985. Families that had been on that ground for 2 and 3 generations. Equipment sold at fractions of its value, land sold at whatever the bank would take. Ray Sutter watched it from the co-op dock, same dock where he'd laughed at the Pemberton elevator coming out of the auction on Eunice's trailer. The mood at the co-op was something between grief and anger, and the particular helplessness that comes when an entire way of life is in trouble and there's no single person to blame for it. In the spring of 1983, the Holvenstadt place came up. 160 acres of good Shelby County ground, better ground than what Eunice farmed. Corn ground, with decent organic matter and drainage tile already in. The family had bought it in 1976 at the top of the market and couldn't make the payments at 1983 prices. The bank had the note, and the bank had run out of patience. The opening bid was $220 an acre. A land speculator from Omaha pushed it to $265. Eunice bid $290. The speculator went to $310. Eunice said $335. The speculator looked across the auction yard at this woman in work clothes with grease still under 2 of her fingernails, and apparently decided she was either crazy or serious. He found out she was serious when she went to $360 and didn't hesitate. He dropped out at $360. 160 acres at $360 an acre, $57,600. Eunice wrote the check that afternoon. 1 check, no financing, no cosigner, no phone call to a banker. The auction yard went quiet in that particular way. That auction yards go quiet when something unexpected has happened, and the crowd is still processing what it means. Ray Sutter was there. He'd come not to bid, but to watch, the way people watch things they don't want to miss, even when they're painful. When the auctioneer announced the buyer, Ray walked over to where Eunice was talking to Calvin at the edge of the crowd. That was $60,000, Ray said. Cash. 57.6, Eunice said. Ray took off his cap. He was 53 years old, and he had been in the grain business his entire adult life, and he understood money the way men in his business understood money, as something that moved in and out and was always attached to some note or obligation somewhere. The idea of a woman who farmed 80 acres and fixed equipment in a machine shed, having $60,000 in a checking account, was not something his mental model had room for. Where does that come from? He asked. Not intrusively, genuinely, like he actually needed to know. Eunice looked at him for a moment. From not spending it, she said. From not borrowing it. From building things instead of buying them. Ray nodded slowly. He was quiet for a moment. I laughed at you, he said, when you hauled that elevator out of the auction in 1971. Told everybody at the co-op you'd bought the most worthless rig in the county. Eunice remembered. She didn't say she remembered. I was wrong about what I was looking at, Ray said. I saw a broken machine. I should have looked at who was driving the truck. That's a generous way to put it, Eunice said. He extended his hand. She shook it. They didn't say anything else about it. There wasn't much else to say. The land was hers. The check had cleared before sundown. Let me tell you how this ends, because the ending is the part that matters most. Eunice farmed the combined 240 acres through the rest of the 1980s and into the 1990s with the same equipment philosophy she'd always had. Secondhand where possible, built where necessary, repaired before replaced. The phase converter she'd built in 1971 ran without significant maintenance until 1989, when she rebuilt it on a Saturday afternoon as a precaution, not because it had failed. It hadn't failed. She just didn't like running old capacitors past a certain age. The grain elevator ran until 1994, 23 years of harvest seasons, before the bucket belt finally wore out, and Eunice decided to replace the entire leg with a newer unit she found at an equipment auction in Audubon County. She paid $180 for it. She stripped the old Pemberton frame for useful metal before she took it down, because Harmon had taught her that useful metal is always useful. Margie took over the farm operation in 1997 when Eunice was 64. Calvin had developed a back problem that limited his field work, and Margie, who had grown up watching her mother approach every broken thing as a problem to be solved rather than a cost to be incurred, ran the operation the same way. Their son, who was 14 in 1997, had been spending his summers in the shop since he was 9. He could weld a decent bead by the time he was 12. By 14, he was asking questions that Eunice didn't always have the answers to, which meant they had to figure it out together. The same arrangement she'd had with Harmon, the same method passing forward. In 2001, the Iowa Farm Bureau asked Eunice to speak at their annual meeting in Des Moines. Someone on the program committee had heard about the phase converter project from a farmer who'd known her in the 1970s and thought her story was worth telling. Eunice agreed to go. She stood at the podium in a hotel conference room in front of 200 farmers and extension agents and rural lenders, and she told the story of the $28 elevator and the $35 motor and the $147 total and the $57,600 check she'd written in 1983. The room was quiet the way the auction yard had been quiet in 1983. The same quality of home silence. The kind that means people are doing math in their heads and coming up with answers that don't fit what they thought they knew. Afterward, a young woman of about 30 came up to her. She farmed 120 acres in Monona County with her husband. They were trying to figure out how to afford an equipment upgrade they felt they needed, and she was wondering if Eunice had any advice. "What do you actually need the machine to do?" Eunice asked. The woman explained. It was a materials handling problem, moving grain from one bin configuration to another. Eunice asked 3 more questions. Then she said, "I don't think you need a new machine. I think you need a motor and 30 feet of used auger and an afternoon in the shop. Are you comfortable with a welder?" The young woman said she was. Eunice wrote down a parts list on the back of the program booklet and gave it to her. She estimated the total at $90 to $110 depending on what the woman could find at auction. "I'll be fine," the young woman said. "Thank you." "That's all it is," Eunice said. "You look at what the job actually requires and you find the cheapest, honest way to do it. Don't pay for more than the job needs. Don't borrow for what you can build." The young woman looked at the parts list. "I never thought of it that way." "Most people don't," Eunice said. "They ask what something costs. You should ask what it needs to do. Those are different questions." Harmon Quill had said something like that once, at the workbench, watching Eunice puzzle over a repair that seemed like it needed a part that cost more than the machine was worth. He'd said it offhandedly, the way he said most things worth saying. "You're asking the wrong question. Don't ask what it costs. Ask what it needs to do." Eunice had been 17. She had remembered it for 47 years. She drove home from Des Moines on a Tuesday night in October, back roads through Audubon County and into Shelby, past the co-op in Harlan, where Ray Sutter had stood on the dock in 1971 and laughed at the elevator on her trailer. The dock was dark at that hour. The co-op was closed. But she knew the building and she knew the dock. And she felt, briefly, the memory of that afternoon, the weight of the Pemberton elevator on the trailer, the knowledge of what she was going to do with it, so clear in her mind that other people's laughter had seemed like noise from a different world. She had known what she was looking at. That was the whole of it. She had known what she was looking at, and they had not. The $28 elevator, the $35 motor, the $147 total, the $57,600 check. The lathe in the shop still running, and her grandson at 14, already asking the right questions. I keep coming back to the moment Ray Sutter asked Eunice to say the number twice. $147. He needed to hear it again because his mind wouldn't accept it the first time. That's not a story about money. That's a story about two completely different ways of seeing the world, and the gap between them being exactly $57,453 sitting in a Shelby County savings account. What strikes me about Eunice isn't the cleverness of the phase converter, though that alone is remarkable. It's that she never separated knowing from doing. Most of us learn things and file them away. Eunice read about rotary phase conversion in a 1966 farm journal and held it in her mind for 5 years until she had a reason to build one. That's not just intelligence. That's a particular kind of integrity between what you know and what you're willing to act on. A lot of people knew things in 1971 that could have solved problems. Eunice was the one who picked up the welder. I think about Harmon Quill a lot when I think about this story. He never sent his daughters to a trade school or an engineering program. He just handed them harder jobs. He charged fair and he stood behind his work, and he passed that down the same way he passed down how to read a spark pattern off a grinder wheel. Not as a lecture, but as a way of being. Eunice didn't decide to be honest in her pricing because she calculated that it would build long-term goodwill. She charged fair because that was the rule she'd grown up with, and she saw no reason to change it. That's the difference between a policy and a character. Policies bend under pressure. Character doesn't. And then there's the staying power. Gerald died in 1968, and Eunice was 35 years old, with 80 acres and aging equipment, and no partner and a daughter still in high school. She kept farming, not heroically, not dramatically. She just kept going the way people keep going when they've decided that stopping isn't something they're willing to do. She found Calvin. She took on repair work. She drove to a government surplus sale in Des Moines looking for a specific motor, because she already knew what she was going to build. That's not stubbornness. That's something steadier than stubbornness. It's the kind of persistence that doesn't need an audience because it was never performing for one. What I find hardest to shake is the image of her driving home from Des Moines on a Tuesday night in October, 30 years after buying that elevator, passing the dark co-op dock in Harlan. She wasn't thinking about vindication. She wasn't replaying Ray's laugh from 1971. She was thinking about a 14-year-old boy in her shop asking the right questions. The $28 elevator, the $35 motor, the $57,600 check. All of it already absorbed into the next generation, already becoming the way her grandson would someday look at a broken thing and see not a problem but a starting point. That's how it actually works, I think. Not in dramatic reversals or public apologies, though those came too, in the quiet transfer of a way of seeing. Harmon to Eunice, Eunice to Margie, Margie to a boy at a lathe who doesn't yet know what he knows. The $147 was never really about the money. It was about what kind of person spends it that way.